Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and start the introduction so Solange and Carolyn have enough time to go through everything they're going to share. It's amazing. So welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Cindy Olson, founder of Executive Strategic Alliance. And in a past life, I was a CHRO of Enron. Somebody's not on mute that's talking. You guys mind?
I think it's Tiffany.
Tiffany?
You're good.
Maybe, yeah. Anyway, so just a couple of things, guys. I think you saw that we are recording this, and we'll send the recording out with the deck that Solange uses in her presentation as a follow-up email. And then feel free to ask questions. You can come off mic anytime or put those in chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So hopefully we'll get through all the questions, and hopefully we have some time at the end to address questions as well. So just a little bit about ESA before we get started. For the past 6 years now, we've partnered with ADP to build this executive community of over 2,000 participants in 20 cities, and we deliver world-class disruptive thought leadership. And by the way, I saw Paul Moskowitz is on, and if he remembers, so I went to him and I said, do you think this is a good idea? I'd love to really bring world-class thought leaders to executives to think about the future. And so, Paul, glad you're here. Anyway, we bring the thought leadership to chart the future. And then we also bring exposure to innovative technologies that are shaping the future. And I noticed that Marilyn Pearson Hendricks is on, and I work with her really closely on next generation technologies. We're unique in that we bring CHROs, CIOs, and other work tech executives to the table because we fundamentally believe that they all have to be in lockstep to really produce the kind of worker experience that everyone needs to be able to attract and retain talent. So we also encourage executives to stay involved in the network, even if they've made a change in their careers, by offering a board positioning membership that helps executives find their perfect board seat. And we have added also this year a partnership with Targeted Velocity that helps executives develop what we're calling a portfolio lifestyle that includes advisory roles, working with PE firms if they prefer not to continue in a full-time executive role. So today, we're really especially honored to have with us Dr. Solange Charas. And Solange, she's a senior level human resources expert with over 30 years of experience. And she was the Chief Human Resource Officer at Havas Worldwide, Binfield Group, and Praetorian Financial Services Group, and held senior level positions at Ernst & Young, Arthur Andersen, and Towers Watson. She serves on the boards of 2 public companies, holding the chairperson's role for the audit and remuneration committees. She's a distinguished principal research fellow with the Conference Board, and she's a recognized expert in the area of human capital analytics and develop proprietary approaches to create and manage high-performing teams. And joining Solange is a guest executive, a rock star, Carolyn Schneider, who is currently the CHRO of Ardent Health. She has worked in private equity-backed investor-owned health system sectors throughout her entire career. Prior to Ardent, she served as CHRO as Horizon Health in Brentwood, Tennessee, and led human resources for 10 years at Capella Healthcare. She majored in humanities at Southern Methodist University in Dallas and received her master's degree in business administration from Vanderbilt University's Owen School of Management in Nashville. You guys are in for a treat. These two are really amazing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Solange. It's all yours, Solange.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. One of the things that you didn't mention that I do, believe it or not, I still do more things, is I teach. I teach in 4 master's programs in 4 different universities. And my passion is to prepare the next generation of human capital professionals to have both financial and data literacy skills, because I think that that's the key to success moving forward. And I'm really excited to have Carolyn as my co-pilot here. She's so well credentialed, and we discovered that we've been doing this kind of work with this level of financial and data analytics competencies for more than 20 years in our respective organizations. So, I sometimes feel like I'm a 30-year overnight success when it comes to data analytics and, business insights. So what I want to talk to you about today is how to link people and business strategy together, and the very unique role that the CHRO plays in this effort, in this aspiration to be able to quantify and communicate and prove using data and evidence-based approaches the material or financial impact that human capital has on the enterprise. The way that I see this is basically following a treasure map. And when you get to the X, there's not just one treasure chest there. There are two treasure chests. And the two treasure chests are the personal brand enhancement that a CHRO receives by being able to quantify and show the accretive impact of human capital on corporate outcome, and the enterprise level benefit of that. So not only do you get a personal brand enhancement, which is one treasure chest, but you actually get to be known and have profitability attributed to HR, which is out of the mindset of both the board and your C-suite team executive, your cohort. They don't think, especially the CFO, they don't think of human capital as value creating for the organization. They think of it as a sunk cost, as a necessary evil. And what we want to do is we want to show them that that's not the case. And you as professionals know that. What I'm hoping to do is give you some tools so that you can take what you know and move it into the realm of evidence-based and data-driven approaches. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to skip over this since Cindy did such a great introduction for me, but I'm going to stop just for a second and tell you a little story. So about 8 years ago, I did some research and wrote an article with 2 other women about the distinction between mentoring and sponsoring for women in organizations. Women are really great at getting mentors, but they're not very good at getting sponsors. And sponsors are the people that actually help women get ahead in their careers. And one of the reasons that women are not very good at getting sponsors is because they're not very good at asking for what they want. They typically wait until they're recognized instead of being proactive and saying, this is who I am, this is what I've done, this is what I want. So in that vein, I've given you a QR code there. I'm going to ask you to buy my book, because that's really what I want. I want you guys to get the benefit of what Stella Lapouchore and I wrote in this book called Humanizing Human Capital, which is really what this talk is about, using data and evidence-based approaches to not only enhance the impact of human capital, but help you be successful in terms of your brand and in terms of getting yeses for budget allocation that's so critical to making the organization successful. So I think I've sat on this long enough for you to capture a picture of the QR code. That will take you to our website, and then you can buy the book from any source, any way that you like to buy your books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, whatever. Okay, so what we want to talk about today are the forces that are shaping the evolving and exciting role of the CHRO, the skills, competencies, and relationships that you need to develop to address the new demands, applying financial concepts and data analytics abilities to do this, quantify impact, generate the business case, and enhance your personal brand. And we're actually going to walk through 2 business cases, 2 case studies that I think will bring that to life. And, Carolyn is going to give you her experience of using these approaches to be successful. I'm sure that all of you are aware of the fact that the human capital space it has been forever changed 3 years ago when the SEC said for public companies, they are now required to disclose information about human capital if it is material to the operating and financial results of the organization. I expected almost every public company, at least 90% of public companies. I see your question, Rick, and I'll address it in a second. I expected 90% of all public companies to disclose something about human capital in terms of its material impact, because for more than 90% of organizations, human capital cost is typically more than 50% of total expense. When you spend more than 50% of your total operating expense on a topic, you would expect organizations to disclose on the performance of that investment. We're seeing very slow adoption of disclosures based on the principles-based rule, which is what the prior SEC head, Jay Clayton, released the rule, right? So it's a what is called a principles-based approach, which means if you deem it to be material, then you disclose. Gary Gensler is of a different mindset. He's the current chair of the SEC. He is a rules-based approach person. And we expect in April, sometime in this coming month, that the SEC is going to disclose the disclosure rules on a principles-based approach, which means that even if you don't think it's material, you are still going to be required to disclose certain pieces of information related to your human capital performance. And that is the great equalizer. The reason that we're seeing more disclosures in this area is not just because investors want to understand the return on investment in human capital. And that started with the Human Capital Management Coalition, an organization or coalition of organizations that had, at last count, something like $8 trillion of assets under management. They are the ones that started this. They wrote this letter to Jay Clayton probably 6 years ago around enhanced human capital disclosures. But now we see other stakeholders calling for disclosures, not just investors and governance monitors, but customers are basing their purchase decisions based on the transparency of how companies treat their employees, especially around workplace conditions, pay equity, and LGBTQ+ and DE&I. Communities are interested. They want economic development. They want appropriate representation of the labor force in organizations. There are 42 states now that require some level of pay transparency. So communities are looking at that as well. Strategic partners, they want to work with organizations that have the same philosophy around human capital and human capital disclosures. And last but not least, and probably most important, is our employees, who are basically saying, we want a voice, we want agency, we want to be treated fairly. With a shrinking labor force, they are now getting more power. And we need to think about them. In fact, the book is written from the perspective of the employee journey, the employee experience. So we actually talk about the traditional way of organizing human capital and the new way of organizing human capital through the lens of the employee. And we think it's a win-win. If employees win, then organizations win. It's not a zero-sum game. Carolyn, do you have anything to add about to this sort of evolving landscape?
Yeah, I think that, for years, we've talked about a talent war. And I've always sort of hated that term. But I think we are really seeing sort of the shrinkage, as you mentioned, of the labor market. And we're going to have to understand better all of the things that impact the labor force, and you can only do so with measuring. so that you can be prepared to think differently about how you staff and maybe some, newer technologies that you can use. So yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that, because the traditional view of an employment arrangement is to have full-time W-2 wage earners. And the workforce is no longer inclined to have that kind of an arrangement. They want to change the social contract. Employees want to change the social contract with their employers. A good example of this is Walmart. So at the end of last year, Walmart had 190,000 gig workers in their system of 2.3 million employees. And their goal was to go from the 190,000 to 400,000 gig workers, which would represent about 17% of their workforce being gig or flexible workers. And they felt that that was going to satisfy two things: their ability to attract, hire, and retain workers, as they need the labor. And the second is their ability to schedule workers. Because if you've got a W-2 wage earner, they traditionally think of themselves as a 9-to-5er, especially in a retail environment. Gig workers are happy to have flexible work arrangements. And what they thought was that the 190,000 that they already had wasn't enough to cover the gaps that they were seeing in being able to schedule labor. So if they have 400,000 gig workers, they're more likely to be able to have a continuous labor presence when they needed it. So, let's not be afraid of having new types of arrangements with employees. Of course, they did all the analytics to make sure that it was financially, feasible. But, they're changing their philosophy. Let me address these two questions that are in the chat room right now. So Rick asks, how might your work relate to or parallel to Jack Fitz-End's work? Fitz-End's was a consultant and a partner to Arthur Andersen when I was there. I know his work really, really well. Fitz-End is brilliant at looking at productivity and staffing within the HR function. And the work that I do is actually connecting the dots between what's happening inside of HR to enterprise level performance. And that's something that Fitz-End's didn't do. So his work is really valuable. You can use it, but take it the next step and connect it to enterprise level outcomes. And some of the metrics that Fitz-End's uses is not included in the portfolio of the metrics that I use and that Carolyn is using and has been using for the last 20 years. And we're going to get to that when we get to the case study. So great question. The second question is from Paul. We do know something about the details around the metrics that are going to be required. At a minimum, we know that there are going to be 4 metrics required. One, and the metrics that are going to be, or the data that's going to be required for disclosure is very fundamental, very basic, but is going to have to stand the scrutiny of an audit. So just like financial information that's disclosed has an audit review or has been reviewed by a third party independent, the human capital data that's going to be disclosed is also going to have to stand up to that same rigor. The 4 pieces of information that we know are fundamental and we believe are going to be required, and there may be more, but these are the 4 that we were pretty certain about. One is workforce composition. So the percent of full-time, part-time, gig, seasonal. So how is your workforce made up? The second is also around demographics. So diversity. So race, gender, and ethnicity is going to need to be disclosed. The third is going to be around workforce stability. So retention levels and attrition levels. So a reader can actually understand how stable your workforce is. And the fourth, which is the one that's the most exciting for me, is a disclosure of total cost of workforce. So right now, companies typically disaggregate their workforce cost. They put some in cost of goods. They put some in marketing. They put some in sales. They put some in R&D. They put some of workforce cost in administration. It's completely disaggregated. The requirement is that you aggregate your workforce cost and you disclose it as an auditable line item expense in your P&L. And that's really exciting because we'll finally be able to understand exactly how much money organizations are spending on their workforce. Let's see. Richard just made a comment. I don't think there's a question in there. Okay, so I'm gonna accelerate now. As I said, my goal, my passion is to teach the next generation of HR professionals, both financial literacy and analytics capabilities. We want HR people to be able to read financial statements and use financial terminology because that's the language of business. We want them to be able to understand financial metrics, especially those that are impacted by human capital, like revenue and expense. And what else is there in a financial statement? Quantify the material impact of human capital, and not just to be able to say, this is the return on investment that we're getting in our initiatives, but this is the overall impact of human capital as a driver of economic value, and to be able to create those financial business cases to support their ask. So the one that I love the most, and the one that I've used for the last 30 years, is to calculate the cost of attrition of an organization and compare that to the budget ask for salaries, right? And in the old days, in my generation, people left companies mostly because they weren't getting paid well enough or they hated their boss. Today, people leave organizations for many, many different reasons. So we can't just narrow it down to, pay issues. But there are so many times that CHROs have gone to their CFO and asked for a 6 or an 8% increase in pay budget to stem attrition without showing the return on that investment, just for the CFO to say, I'm not giving you 8% more budget, without understanding that the cost of attrition can sometimes be 20 or 30% of a payroll budget. So if you present that to the CFO and say, we can either spend 30% of payroll in replacing all these people that are leaving and losing productivity, or we can spend 8% and drop that attrition, which one is the CFO going to pick, an 8% or a 30% cost? And it makes sense that they would pick an 8% cost and cross their fingers and hope that it works, or ask you to show them how you came up with those numbers, right? Analytics capabilities provide data-driven evidence and understand the interrelatedness of human capital programs. And the third bullet here, and this is probably all very, natural and, something that probably all of you do to some extent, both financial and analytics capabilities. The third is you and your CFO, or you and your CFO staff, should become very close friends. And having served as a CHRO for 3 different organizations, and I have an MBA in accounting and finance and a minor in taxation, I am a CFO's best friend. The CFOs hate HR. They don't understand it. It's a sunk cost for them. We need to change that relationship, because when the SEC disclosure requirements come out, the CFO cannot do the reporting for HR. HR needs to be able to quantify the material impact. You're going to have to create a partnership. Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with your CFO?
Well, I have a great relationship, and it's interesting because whenever I've been in whatever companies I've been in, that's sort of one of the first relationships I really try to develop, because we have to speak, I lovingly call this, we have to speak their love language, right? And their love language is finance and understanding data and being able to present facts as opposed to feelings. And so I guess when I think about it, any good decision is really based on fact. And so if we can bring the data to our leaders in the story form, right, then they'll make the right decision. So, so many people say, well, how did you get them to get there? I said, just present the facts, right? These are smart people. They understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just skip over this because I'm going to assume that in your roles, you have some level of financial literacy, but I really like this, Gary Larson, The Far Side. If you haven't seen this before, it's What We Say to Dogs and What They Hear. And this is in no way to assume that we are the dogs or finance is the dogs. It's just two different languages that are being spoken. And, you know, the man is speaking to his dog, okay, Ginger, I've had it, stay out of the garbage, right? Ginger, and what they hear is blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. And so we need to close that communication gap between finance and human resources so that neither side is just hearing their name, they're actually speaking the same language. So that's my little humor. This is some of the stuff that I teach my students, that there are financial metrics, right, that are typically divided into 5 categories. I squished 2 of them together, liquidity and solvency, because HR people don't need that much definition. But efficiency, liquidity and solvency, profitability and valuation, that's the language of finance. They create ratios that demonstrate their performance in each one of these areas. I've given you the financial ratios down the right-hand side. So inventory turnover, quick ratio, profit margins, EPS. That's the language of finance. And HR does not know that language. And even if HR to understand that language, they have to learn how to speak that language. So for every financial ratio type, efficiency, liquidity, solvency, profitability, and valuation, I teach my students how to transform human capital performance into an equivalent financial ratio. So that if they want to talk about efficiency, right, that's equivalent to inventory turnover and working capital turnover, they can talk about productivity ratio, they can talk about separation ratio, they can talk about mobility ratio, they can talk about recruiting success ratio. Those are all measures of efficiency of human capital. And you can see it gets a little bit more sophisticated as we move through the different ratio types to valuation ratio, where we measure HCROI, return on investment in human capital. So that's sort of setting the context for what we're hoping the human capital function evolves into. Okay, so now that I've given you a little bit of a primer, I wanted to walk through very quickly 2 case studies that I did on 2 real companies. I worked with their CHROs. We curated the financial data. The CHRO gave me their HR data. And we basically just did a very rudimentary analytics and quantified the opportunity, the financial opportunity, the accretive opportunity on profitability. So there are 2 examples here. I don't know if we'll get through both of them, but we'll do our best. The first one is on attrition. I basically took a treasure map and divided it into 4 quadrants and said, you can enter this treasure map in any quadrant. So if attrition is your issue, or DE&I is your issue, or productivity is your issue, or L&D is your issue, or your challenge, then enter the map in any quadrant you want. But this is what you're going to do. You're going to follow this 6-step pathway to define the appropriate measurement period, develop your hypothesis. And as HR professionals, we always have a hypothesis brewing in the back of our minds, right? We're always looking at, what do we think caused this outcome? And then we use our intuition, and we have to move from our intuition into a quantitative environment if we are going to be effective or be compelling in our storytelling. So develop your hypothesis and also think about the type of impact that it has on financial performance ultimately. Gather the information, do the analyses, quantify the impact on financial performance with real data, not just your intuition, and then create the compelling narrative. So this is the real life example. We looked at a 1-year period measured by quarters. And we believe that the attrition impacts human capital costs, which impacts profitability. So if you have high attrition, you're spending a lot of money replacing people, and that's just the hard dollar cost of it. But you're also having an opportunity loss in terms of the productivity of open jobs. So we want to assess both. And when we quantify the cost of that attrition, it enhances our expenses, which lowers our profitability. So that's the opportunity. We gathered a lot of data. Actually, we didn't even gather that much data. We gathered a few pieces of financial information, a few pieces of cost information, and mostly for this, we looked at headcount, we looked at time to hire, we looked at number of new hires, attrition rate, time to fill job, the average salary, and hard dollar cost to fill jobs. And what we did is we have this calculator that's available to everybody, where you can just go to our turnover cost calculator and you put in the information and it actually calculates your cost of attrition. We have also an HCROI calculator, which I think we're going to show you a little later. So we baseline the performance today, and then we create a set of assumptions about how we can improve that performance and quantify that delta. So here's just a snapshot, the cost of attrition as a percent of payroll for these quarters and the cumulative cost. So it's 21% of quarterly payroll, 12%, 9%, and 6%. As you can see, this is going from December to September 22. So the more recent dates are at the beginning. And so their cost of attrition keeps going up. Based on the calculator, the cumulative cost of attrition for that year was $42 million. If they could hold their attrition at 6%, which is what it was at the beginning of the measurement cycle, they could actually save $28 million in cost avoidance. So we're quantifying the benefit at $28 million. Now it's up to you to figure out how much you're willing to spend or how much you can spend to reduce attrition from 21 to 6% again. And maybe you can't do it with $28 million, right? Maybe you can only get halfway there. So you have to do some sensitivity analyses to understand what is feasible and what you can deliver in terms of a promise to your CEO and your board. I tell my students that the best way to understand what's going on is to draw pictures. And HR people don't like to draw pictures. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but I have spoken to so many HR people, and probably nobody in this room, who says, if I wanted to do math, I wouldn't have gone into HR. And that's just not going to cut it anymore. So I draw pictures, and here we have the attrition rate and human capital return on investment. And let me just stop for a second and tell you how to calculate HCROI. It's super simple. It's revenue minus expense adjusted for your cost, your total cost of human capital. So if your expense is $70 million and your cost of human capital is $50 million, you subtract the 50 from the 70, which leaves you $20 million, and you subtract that from your revenue. And that gives you an adjusted profitability that excludes cost of human capital. And then you divide that by your cost of human capital. So you can see exactly what your adjusted profitability is for every dollar invested in human capital. It's easy to do. You could probably do it in your head if you have, like if you're a math nerd like me, but you can certainly do it in a spreadsheet or in a calculator. And what we're seeing here in this organization is kind of interesting, that as their attrition rate goes up, their HCROI is going up. This led me to have a conversation with their CHRO, and what they were doing is they were actually culling the organization of bad performers. So they were leaving the good performers in place. They were actually paying them more, right? And they're seeing that return on investment go up. Here we're seeing attrition rate. HCII is the ratio of investment in human capital as a percent of total expense. So what percent goes to HR? And you can see here that as they spend more on people, they get a better HCROI performance. And I spoke to the CHRO, and they were being really smart about how they were investing in people. For the most part, they were not throwing money at salaries. They were actually creating programs that supported employees in terms of getting skills and competencies, in terms of having better work-life balance, in terms of having all sorts of mental health and financial health benefits. And then what we're seeing here is, except for this last quarter, and I asked her about it, and she said that there was a extraordinary event that actually made their profitability go down that had nothing to do with HR. You can see that there is a trend between HCROI and profitability performance, except for this last quarter. So that's basically how easy it is to take data and create a financially justified rationale for asking for spend and creating benefit for the organization. So the last part of it.
Solange, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm watching the clock and Carolyn's got to leave in about 5 minutes. So you might want to have her just talk a little bit about the attrition that she's, her story.
Perfect. So, and Caroline showed me earlier before we went live, all the graphs that she used to present in her management meeting that looked exactly like this, that she's been doing for the last 20 years. So Carolyn, bravo to you.
Thank you, Solange. Yeah, we were talking about some of the work that Solange is doing, and I pulled out an old scorecard that I had from 2003 when I worked for another employer, where we were measuring labor as a percentage of revenue per FTE, obviously time to fill for your recruiting folks, but human capital value added, which Solange is also, I think you'll see on here, as well as the human capital ROI. It's really interesting to having pulled this out and then looking at comparing it to the work that she's doing. I was like, wow, I was doing that 20 years ago. It's kind of fun. But one of the things I did coming into Ardent almost 2 years ago, we really weren't we were paying attention to numbers. We had a lot of data, but the way we were looking at it wasn't quite telling the story. So for example, and I'll just use the attrition and turnover data, we were measuring turnover from less than a year and then 1 to 5 years and so forth. And all the work that's been done in research tells you that especially for millennials, that the first 2 years, people are highly engaged, but they're not highly loyal. And then at that 2-year point, they become highly loyal. So if we can get people to stay for 2 years, the chances of them staying with us long term are so much better. It just continues to go up. And so one of the first things I did is took a look at the way we were measuring, and I said, you guys, there's an opportunity here. Can you please show me by month that first 24 months when we're losing people? And when we popped it open and people looked at the first 90 days, they were like, oh, wow, I had no idea we had this problem. So measuring the right things is important. And then the other piece of this is, when we were setting up a strategy, we took a look and said, okay, right now my turnover is at 22%. It's costing me $163 million a year in opportunity costs by having this level of turnover. So we set an aim and a target to improve our turnover to a 15% level, which would decrease the cost of turnover by $32 million in our organization. And so, and when I frame that up for my leaders, they're all in, but and I also was very intentional about the way that I framed it up, because again, going back to my CFO, if I actually gave them the true cost of turnover, for us, it's about $70,000 per person. They would sort of not believe that. They'd think I was inflating I know what was true, but I had to get their buy-in first. And so we used a $40,000 a year number, which you can go all over anywhere and look at the cost of nursing. And that's a very, very low number, but one that, was digestible to my accounting folks. So we've done some really good work. Last year, we reduced our nurse turnover by 6.75% and our overall turnover by 1.75% by doing things such as Solange is talking about, which is investing in our people. And then I'll say one other thing that I think is interesting that you can do with data. I've been working, have done some work with a group of data scientists to take a look at, they wanted to solve the problem, how much money should you invest in retention how much money should you invest in retention? And at what point do you no longer get any benefit? And so we did this exercise with a data set of about, it was IBM workers. So I think there were probably 2,000 or more, it might've been 20,000 people who had exited IBM. And what we found was that if you spent more than $2,000, you got a diminishing return on your investment. And so things like that, where you can really pinpoint, okay, how much is the proper amount to spend on retention, and which demographic group do I need to spend it on? Because if I look at my demographic group, my 18 to 25-year-old males, I looked at that, they churn at a higher rate as their careers are getting started. And then that levels off about when they become in the 30s, because they're starting to settle down, have families, that kind of thing. And if I put that money towards my 60 plus group, which is a high turnover rate, and you could look at this and go, well, do I really put this is where I should spend my money on first glance, but then you think about, oh, well, these are people who are exiting the company because they're retiring. So anyway, that's really all that I think that I could add to this, because I think that this is such a rich topic, and Solange captures it so brilliantly. So thank you.
Thank you. And Carolyn raises a really interesting point. If you've got a budget to spend, you need to figure out how to prioritize that allocation based on the return. So Carolyn was saying there's a diminished return when you hit $2,000. Well, maybe you want to take that $2,000 and put it someplace else where you're going to have a better outcome, right? Maybe retention isn't the place that you're going to get the best return or the best bang for the buck. Maybe it's going to be around training and development, or maybe it's going to be around wellness, right? But how do you know that unless you run the numbers and understand the ROI of those investments, which is what this last chart is highlighting, that you need to create that compelling narrative. I affectionately like to say that CFOs are ROI addicts. That's all they want, is to understand ROI, and they chase the biggest ROI that they can. And they're sort of agnostic to where that ROI is going to come from, as long as they get their ROI hit. So if you can show them that they will get a bigger ROI from investing in an HR program than they will anywhere else, and their ROI is going to be greater than the weighted average cost of capital, then you got a winner. So for this organization, we said, let's take $10 million and say, let's invest that in retention or in programs that we think are going to reduce attrition. If it's $10 million and the opportunity is a $28.5 million savings, cost avoidance, then we're actually expecting an $18.5 million benefit from a $10 million investment. That's 185% ROI. If I told you, come give me $1 this year, and I'll give you $185 at the end of the year, everyone would give me their dollar, right? That is a great return. Cindy, I don't think that we have time to go through another example, and maybe we should just open it up to questions and discussion, observation. Maybe others want to share their experience in using data analytics to craft financially rationalized communications. What do you think?
That would be great. I know Rick has another question in the chat if you want to address that one. And my question to everybody else is, do you guys have questions you'd like to ask Solange, or do you want her to start into the next example?
Yeah,
And if
then
you don't have questions, I think we go ahead and jump into it and then know that we may not complete it. But go ahead and answer Rick's. He's got a question.
So there's less comfort on the part of non-HR decision makers with the financially based assumptions we use when making HR ROI presentations, and those that underlie financial accounts. Right. So I have experienced that. And what I do is I'm very transparent about the assumptions that are used in the calculations. HCROI, there are two different types of human capital metrics. There are macroeconomic indicators or macroeconomic metrics, and then there are program level metrics. The program level metrics are the harder ones for non-HR people to get their heads around, because we're talking about attrition, retention, learning and development impact, well-being impact, and it's a little bit more touchy-feely. But the macroeconomic indicators are very easy for financial people to understand because we use financial information. So HCROI, I said, was revenue minus expense divided by human capital cost divided by human capital cost. A financial person gets that. Human capital value add, HCVA, the same numerator, the denominator is full-time equivalent headcount. And that tells you the profitability contribution allocated to every employee. They understand that. Human capital investment intensity, human capital cost divided by total revenue. Total expense. They get that. Human economic value add, human capital market value. These are all formulas, and I'm happy to share them with you. They're not in this presentation, but I'm happy to share those formulas for the macroeconomic indicators that non-HR people can easily get their head around, because it doesn't have to do with behavior. It has to do with aggregate level financial impact, right? And it's really easy to curate your financial information. If you're a public company, it's disclosed. If you're a private company, then make friends with your CFO. And when I do work with clients, I get data from two different sources. HRIS systems or payroll systems is one. And then the pre-closing trial balance and income statement, pre-closing trial balance sheet and income statement, where I'm just curating every dollar that's allocated to an HR expense. And you're using their data. So Rick, it's hard for them to argue with you when you're using their data. Yeah?
Thank you.
So I do this sometimes, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to put a couple people on the spot. Laura Clark, hey, do you have any examples of some of the things that you're doing around this kind of measurement that you can share with the group?
So I would say, just for the group, I work for a family office, the third and fourth generation. They have a legacy business, and then they have acquisitions. And the work that we're doing is more focused right now on the 3 precision manufacturing plants that we've bought and building them as a platform and making HR strategic. And I would say, in all candor, I wish there were some numbers that I wish that I had dialed in quicker on, because I could have saved ourselves a lot of conversation. Because the leaders in these, and they're all small, so they're all 130 down to 70 people. And they have people who run into the HR's office and say, we need people.
Yeah.
And they have no idea what kind of people they need. And we're terrible at hiring. We can't find anyone. It's like one of our plants hired, the one that has 130 people in it, hired 38 people last year. It's like, guys, you're fine at hiring. You might be picking the wrong people because you have no idea what you need.
Right.
But I don't want to hear that the HR person isn't that good and can't hire. She hired 38 people last year. And so the power of those metrics has been really amazing. And what I love about manufacturing, our core business is in media. You add a reporter, it's incredibly difficult to quantify how much they're going to drive the value up. Manufacturing is awesome. It's like, I'm gonna put that person on that machine. They're gonna have this many earned hours and we get this return. It's amazing.
And Laura,
Thank you.
I'm happy that you brought up that you're an acquisitive company, because these metrics are so critical when you're evaluating an acquisition. And
Yes,
it's not just looking at the effectiveness and efficiency and the ROI of investments in human capital. If you're going to integrate that acquisition into your corpus, into your organization, you want to understand whether or not that acquisition is going to have a deleterious or a salubrious impact on your overall performance. So if their HCROI is half as much as yours, and they're about the same size in terms of revenue or people, your HCROI performance is going to go down. So
Right.
you want to be mindful of, not only is that a healthy acquisition, but how is that going to impact our financials when we integrate the two organizations?
yes,
I also know investors who say, I want to buy a company that has crappy HR because it's super accretive. Like, if we fix that problem, because it's so leveraged, if we're spending 60% or 70% of expense on people, and we have HCROI that's not even break even, that's below $1, and we can fix that, it's super leverageable. We can get accretive impact very quickly. So some companies are actually looking for companies that have really bad human capital performance, because it's pretty easy to fix and it's super accretive.
yep, yep. Well, and I would say that's the evolution of our acquisitions, because the family didn't specialize in manufacturing. And so all of us have learned a lot about it. And so the things that we did when we were acquiring those companies, to just look at the cost of their benefits and those sorts of things, the next acquisition will spend a lot more time and have a lot more really strong data, to your point, about where they are from a people perspective.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I've done about 70 acquisitions at this point. I'm always working for the buyer, although I think that there's a huge market to work with the seller to fix
yep,
their processes and their presentation. And there's so many times that I've heard CEOs say, I would never have bought this company if I knew what their HR was like. And that's on them, because there is a way to transform HR due diligence from a compliance check the box to a very dynamic way of measuring the effectiveness and efficiency and contribution, the HCVA and the HEVA, human economic value add of human capital.
yep,
And it's just, you don't have to be brilliant. You just have to be aware. You just have to understand what numbers you're looking for, how to calculate the formulas. And if you're really smart, you'll benchmark that to competitor organizations to see what you're really buying.
Thank God, because I went to journalism school, so this was not where I was focused. I also think that it has a board application, right? So especially if you were, this is math that you could do in a public company, for instance, and be able to talk about it in a way that would be really strong as an applicant. And separate from, I want to be on your board because I do human capital in a squishy way. It's a mathematical approach that would confirm that you knew what you were talking about.
Yeah. And that goes back to Rick's question, which is, how do we establish our credibility? You start with the macroeconomic indicators, because they can't challenge the assumptions, because it's their assumptions, it's their data. And then once you've established your credibility, then you go down to the program level and you can say, oh, look at attrition or retention or performance management or, mobility or succession planning, which requires a little bit more art than science. But you've already established your credibility, so they'll listen to you.
Yep, for sure.
So Solange, I've got a question for you. if somebody that's on this call right now would like to reach out to you and have you just ask questions or maybe come in and take a look at what they're doing, are you available for that?
Oh, absolutely. Please connect with me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Solange Charas there. Do link in. Happy to spend some time just talking through what you're thinking about. You don't have to engage me. You don't have to pay me. I'm happy to have a short diagnostic conversation with you. Give you some insights, some advice, and also very happy to work with you if you want to engage me.
I was kind of looking to see if Fred Hinkie was on, because I'm working with him on M&A. He's going to present M&A for our board positioning membership program. And I think that's a very interesting path that you're talking about. I'd love to connect you with him because I think there's lots there. And it, yeah.
So much
So you guys, I'm going to give you back 3 minutes. I will say this. Solange is working with Christian Gomez of the Marcus Buckingham Company. They're coming up with how do they combine measurements, what Solange is talking about and what the ADP research group is working on. So hopefully that's a thought leadership topic in the next few months. But anybody else have a question before we say goodbye? Nope.
Or just put in the chat if you're actually using data analytics and combining that with financial information in the work that you're doing. I'm really curious to see who's already adopted this type of an approach.
And I can send the chat alongside the presentation that the deck and the recording. Okay, guys. We'll see you in April. Okay. Thanks, Solange. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.